the beautiful thing about the life of Paul, again, he writes from a perspective of in prison, which instantly makes his talking about joy all the more powerful, in my personal opinion. But the process of learning contentment, look at Paul's life. He was at the pinnacle of his in Judaism. He's, Pharisee of Pharisees. He did all these things. He had the authority of the temple to go and to chase after these Christians. He had power and authority and support, and then he lost it all for the sake of Christ. And so you look at when he talks about it in First Corinthians, I went through this and I went through this. The way that we learn is it's the school of life, if you will, because what it seems to me is people miss out. They're reaching for something, they don't get it, they didn't learn that it wasn't theirs to have, and so they're always reaching for something and never having it and missing the moment. I'll give you a personal example. So with our first daughter Eliana, we would always talk about, well, I can't wait till she does this. I can't wait till she does this, yada, yada, yada. But every time I say something like that, I always preface it with, but I love the moment that we have right now. Yeah. I love this moment. Yeah, I can't wait till she talks. And now I'm like, girl, can you be quiet? But I can't wait for this. But right now is where we're at. And this is a beautiful moment. Don't miss it. And so when you look at what Paul says, I have learned, he had been all over the place. He has been on his missionary journeys. He has seen the best parts and the worst parts of humans. And, he's learned that it's going to come, it's going to go, it's going to rise, it's going to fall. Contentment. I would add, I think about contentment in this way. So sometimes it's about the stuff, like people don't have enough stuff. That's why they don't have contentment. I want this, but it's also in your situation. So I want to read a passage that really, I put this, as I was going through this, it stood out to me. Back in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So there's context here, obviously, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul's answering the questions that they have. It says it in very first chapter 7, verse 1. Now concerning the matters which you wrote, he's going to talk about marriage and sexual immorality. But if you go down to verse 17, it says, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Now I'll pause, because so often it's not the stuff that people are seeking, but a different situation. Like our situation is never what we want it to be. I want to be, a 40-year-old preacher that's got the health of a 20-year-old preacher that, can do all these things, has freedom, but also has structure. We always want this other situation, this other context. And so he says, let him not seek circumcision, for neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. He always comes back to this relationship with God is of the utmost importance. But keep reading. We'll read down through verse 24 if that's okay. He says, for neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant? Now, obviously, there's a major struggle with that when we're talking about slavery. He says, when you were called, do not be concerned about it. As in, that's not your focus. That's not your, and again, you can't imagine being a slave, but slavery was a big part of the time period, beyond the shadow of a doubt, with all different levels of slaves, if you would. Do not be concerned about your situation. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself to the opportunity. He's not saying that you should always be a slave, or, that shouldn't be your focus. Again, verse 22, for he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freed man of the Lord. My relationship with God is way more bigger. Is that Donald Trump quote?
I was going to say it trumps, but yeah.
So yeah, it trumps your situation here on earth. He goes, likewise, he who was free when he is called is the bondservant of Christ. You were bought with the price. Do not become bondservants of men, which is what we do when we want all these things, and we're talking about materials or moments or these situations. So brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. And so as I'm going through Philippians, I think about contentment. And then Paul says this, no matter what situation you find yourself in, your focus is on the commandments of God, and you were bought with a price. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but I'm like, that blows my mind, because we get so distracted by, and preachers fall into this. You have preachers that hop every couple years, and I never read into a tent. But sometimes when you get to know them and talk to them, it's just because it's not enough. It's never enough. No situation is good enough. And that's a struggle that not just preachers have, but we have as Christians and people have in general. And Paul says, don't worry about your situation. Be in God. You were bought with a price. Don't become bond servants of men. And I don't know if that's off topic or not, but First Corinthians awesome. 7 was and so some other things I have right here. So in First Timothy 6:6, he's talking about. I better read it so I don't misquote it. He talks about but godliness with contentment is great gain. You go to the context, he's talking about false teachers. Again, a situation with people involved. You go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8. Again, he's talking about contentment there. Verse 8 says, and God is able to make all grace abound to you so that having all sufficiency, it's the same word as contentment, or all contentment, in all things at all times you may abound in every good work. So when we're giving, we're supposed to be content. When we're dealing with false teachers, we're supposed to be content with this idea of sufficiency and satisfaction only in God. And then the last one that I have here, and this is literally just a reference in my Bible, was Hebrews 13, verse 5. Keep your life free from money, from the love of money, and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. You're in a book where the Christians are falling away, going back to Judaism. They wanted a different situation. It wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And here as the book ends, he talks about being content there. And so as I was preparing for the topic, I was like, there's this idea of sometimes it revolves around stuff. But I think more often than not, it's the situation we find ourselves in that we're not satisfied with. And that's probably one of the biggest traps of not being content. And you see it in book after book and verse after verse, where God, through the inspired writers, are trying to get them to see your situation in this world does not matter. Be faithful. And so you go back to the passage in Philippians. He says, whatever I find, wherever I'm at, I have learned the secret. I can do all things in this life through Christ who strengthens me. And that's how we miss it. Our situation isn't what we want it to be. And, the Bible's pretty clear about going through that and saying, you need to remain focused. You need to remain focused. This world's going to pass away. Remember who you are and who you belong to.